to Module 5. So hopefully what you're seeing is that yesterday we started the beginning of the SUMP process. We've done nearly maybe a year and a half's worth of work in one day to move us through to this stage in the SUMP. And now we're going to continue into the next area, which is identifying and testing measures. So this is where it becomes interesting in terms of starting to think about the range of measures and how we organise and how we test these measures.
Okay, yes, so basically, we've set our vision, we've set our objectives, and we've got to think now about what kind of solutions are appropriate to meet those objectives and to contribute towards the vision. And I think, there's a careful process of selecting the different measures. And for starters, there's different types of measures that are available. As you see here, it's not just about infrastructure. I think everybody thinks immediately that infrastructure is the solution to everything. And of course, that's an important part of the process. But there are other different categories of measures that we should be considering as well. These include what we call operational measures. And, by operational, what we mean is obviously looking at how to improve the operation of the transport system itself. So travel information initiatives can improve that. Ticketing can make it easier to transfer between different modes of transport. Traffic management can control the flow of traffic, both car traffic and public transport in the city. And things like intelligent transport systems, the technology to control and manage how a city works. But as well as our infrastructure and operational measures, we also have organizational measures. These are, how to establish new structures, new institutions to control and oversee the implementation of transport solutions. So we need to think about the different organizational improvements that may need to be considered to deliver your SUMP strategy. And that could be, at a sort of a local level, it could be at a regional level, depending on the scale of the sort of improvement you're looking to achieve. So when we're thinking about the measures, it seems obvious, but we need to start thinking of some key answers to some questions. Where are we wanting the measure to operate? When should it operate? Of course, there may be certain times of the day where, there are more problems experienced, the morning and evening peaks. Who's going to use this measure? Is it for everybody, or is it for a certain part of society? Is it for the residents, for the tourists, for the businesses? Who's going to be the end user? And how well used will it be? How intensively will it be used? Is it going to have enough capacity to cater for further expansion and increase? So we need to start thinking about the detail of the measure, the location, the technology, the scope, what kind of objective it's going to address, and importantly, what kind of impact we expect it to have. We're going to talk about monitoring later, but the impacts of a measure and what it's going to achieve is very, very important. We also need to think about what kind of experience you may already have about implementing these measures. Is it something you've used before, implemented before? Is it a new kind of measure? Is there some evidence that it's been successful elsewhere? And I mentioned this morning about benchmarking. Benchmarking also applies to measure selection, identifying the kinds of measures that have been successfully implemented elsewhere. And that's an important thing to consider. It really helps support your case, your business case for this kind of measure. And the final thing to think about in this sort of information on measures is about how easy it is to implement the measure. Some measures will take a long time. Some measures will require approval or acceptance by other parties. So the implementation process, in terms of how easy it is to achieve and deliver, is very, very important.
I think just to re-emphasise, it's important that we're thinking about the risk of the measures that we're taking, because clearly, and there's good examples around Europe of where people have developed SUMP plans and they've had a scheme that they've not really realised is a big risk, and then the problem occurs and the plan falls apart. So considering risk is important, and this will come up later as well.
So, we're looking for the most cost-effective set of solutions to meet your SUMP objectives. So you'll start with a long list of measures. We're an open-ended list of measures that you will then start to look at, start to filter, and start to assess how well those measures meet your objectives. And, it's important to start thinking about the different individual measures that can meet more than one objective. Those are the ones that are likely to have the greatest level of success in contributing to your SUMP. And at this stage, we're looking at all possible interventions, and we're not excluding low-cost solutions. So we've got to think about the link back to the analysis work and back to the objectives. We're going through a filtering process, and this next slide tries to explain the process a little bit more clearly. So we've gone through the analysis and the objective setting at the top. We've got some measures that we've identified. These will be including existing projects that are already being thought about and are maybe in the pipeline. We also may have suggestions from the public. As Daniel mentioned earlier, there were some suggestions from the public about what kind of measures they want to see. So we have our list of potential measures, and we start to think about how well they meet the objectives. What are the sort of indicative costs and impacts of these measures? And we begin to start filtering out the ones that are not so favourable in terms of the objectives, and maybe ones which are too costly and difficult to implement. So we then create what we call a set of reasonable measures. And of course, we have to go back to the stakeholders. We have to explain that these measures are being thought about, being considered as part of an overall strategy. And we can begin to, at this stage, link the measures. And I think this is an important task that people need to think about, is how to connect the different kind of measures together in packages, complementary measures that can provide added benefits. And as an example, you might want to consider, on a bus corridor scheme, you will have maybe some new bus lanes or bus priority measures, which together with some parking controls or some bus stop improvements and information initiatives will provide a comprehensive package of measures for public transport. That's a typical example of a package approach to improvements. We then go through further assessment of these packages, looking at the costs and benefits and doing some more appraisal. And we come out with a final list of measures which can then be further expanded and discussed before final sort of implementation plan establishment. So it's a sequence of tasks there which you need to think about. And it's very much going from a long list to a filtered list and a prioritised final list of schemes and packages. So I mentioned, costs and benefits, and I think there are tools available to help the filtering process, and you need to think about this. So cost-benefit analysis, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is about looking at the overall value for money of the different measures and different schemes. And for some of the larger projects, like a metro project or a tram project, there's likely to be some studies or work done to support the business case for those projects, which provide some information on costs and benefits. And you can use that information in your assessment about their contribution to the SUMP strategy. As well as costs and benefits, there is another tool using multi-criteria analysis. It's very much a mixture of criteria. It's quantitative, it's the numbers, the impacts, the monetarized criteria, and qualitative, what kind of contribution to environment, air quality that might be achieved. And there are examples of the multi-criteria analysis. You can see the different evaluation criteria, and you create a framework table to compare the impact of your measures and interventions you want to achieve. There's lots of different templates and formats for multi-criteria analysis, but it's a useful tool to start thinking about the anticipated outcomes of your measures that you're trying to deliver. At the end of the screening process, there are likely to be a number of different outcomes. Obviously, those schemes that show poor contribution to the objectives or show poor value for money, they're going to be rejected. There'll be some schemes which will be accepted and considered as a high priority with maybe even a strong case for early implementation, maybe quick wins, short-term measures that can really deliver some good benefits. There may be some other schemes which are considered favourable and accepted, but there's a lower priority. They may take longer to develop. The timescale for development is very important to think about, and we're going to discuss that in a bit more detail in the implementation plan module next. And there may be other schemes that are accepted, but they are conditional. And by conditional, that means they are dependent or linked to something else. So, for example, on a bus corridor, you might have some bus lanes that you want to introduce, but you're reliant on the bus operator to provide the vehicles or the level of service to make it all happen. So they need to be joined up and they need to be packaged together. So all of these things, need to be thought about in terms of the state of readiness and how deliverable the measures are. But you have a range of different acceptance there for different kinds of schemes. Now, I want to mention something that you may be aware of, but there are tools available out there. I think at the beginning of this course, we heard about Challenge and LTIS, and under the Challenge initiative, which is obviously very much a European sharing forum for sustainable travel, there is something called a measure option generator, which has information on 64 different types of measures you may wish to consider as part of your urban mobility plans. And you can begin to sort of use this tool to assess different policy situations and how the different measures may contribute towards objectives. So this may be a useful, starting point to think about the contribution of measures towards your SUMP objectives. It might give some useful information to help inform your measure selection process. So, we've gone through this very much a transparent process of filtering down from the long list, and we've got the package of measures, and we've got this short list of promising measures that we think may be important. And we've built in some what we call prioritization of those measures, informed by cost-benefit analysis and multi-criteria analysis. And all of it is informed by stakeholder engagement. Now, packages of measures are, important, as I mentioned. We need to integrate them together, and we need to think about things like integration of land use and transport, as well as between different transport modes. So you can integrate land use measures with transport measures effectively. And I think we've now got the sort of preferred set of measures at the end of the day, and we now have to sort of develop an overall strategy which is based on the packages of measures and the selection of schemes you've chosen to support your objectives. And Kevin's got some examples about how to think about the strategy, how to think about scenarios, which are an important part of the strategic process.
Okay, so this diagram, I think, just starts to link the strategy and the concept level strategy through to the list of measures and the implementation. And I think it's important also to sort of recognise that there are things that are continuous professional tasks on the left-hand side, so things like data modelling and reporting, and that sort of participation of policy, administrative and the public on the right-hand side continue through this kind of linkage between the areas. And I think what we'd want to do really is then create a set of preferred groups of measures combined into a do-it-all scenario. We need to test measures using a SUMP transport model. We need to think about KPIs and targets and start to think about sort of the kind of targets the targets that we sort of need to establish and then to review. And clearly, during this process, we need to keep linking back with the strategic environmental assessment. So, we need to think about the measures that we're proposing and how the packages of measures that we're creating also link to things like sort of secondary effects, the cumulative benefits and the cumulative effects, and the sort of the permanent, the temporary, the positive and the negative effects of schemes on the environment. And clearly, what we need to do is keep consulting through that process, as I've suggested in the last slide. In developing scenarios, it's important, and I think the second sort of point is really quite important, to think about optimizing land use and transport systems to develop a future vision. So, we need to combine a series of sort of urban growth scenarios and urban change scenarios with strategic transport networks. So when we're creating scenarios, we need to think about the other non-transport elements that are linking with our transport and our SUMP in the process. We need to think about alternative scenarios, because a lack of alternative scenarios in a SUMP process means that actually we can create problems in the process. So I just wanted to show a few examples of different cities and different strategies that people have developed within their SUMPs. So in Parma, for example, they started to think about land use plan scenarios and sustainability scenarios, and they went through a 3-phase program of developing from understanding the urban area and the transport system together, setting up a model and defining the plan scenarios, and then selecting the plan scenarios, linking that through to measures and sort of a series of short and medium term indicators. In Milan, they actually started to look at 4 different mobility strategies. So they looked at a balanced approach, an urban accessibility approach using public transport, urban space as a common goal, and passenger and freight mobility demand management. And they projected through to 2024. In Opava, in the Czech Republic, somewhere close to Daniel's heart, I think, 3 scenarios were proposed, and they looked at an optimistic scenario, a medium scenario, and a low scenario. And they developed 19 logical measures in packages, and they range from things like safe cycling, safe streets, crossings, parking regulations. So coming back to the point that Mark makes about this isn't just about infrastructure, this is about also management and sort of organisational issues. And in Pilsen, they looked at 3 different scenarios when they developed their plan. They looked at the regulatory scenario. So on the left, you can see they had sort of quite a regulated scenario where they had parking system with price controls. They had use of information technology. They had network traffic management. So quite a managed and regulated scenario. They had a sort of a liberal scenario in the middle where they looked at the network according to the needs of car traffic. They looked at capacity improvements. They looked at additional car parking capacity, and they looked at sort of things like improving conditions for pedestrians, cyclists, and use of information technology, but mainly to ease traffic movement. And then they had a maintenance scenario as well that they looked at, where they look at achieving sort of very good conditions of existing public transport infrastructure. So you maybe remember yesterday I spoke about the fact that often plans forget we have existing infrastructure. So this scenario started to look at that kind of thing. So parking regulation and cheap construction of car parks, some partial preference of public transport, and looking at infrastructure repairs to existing routes rather than going and looking at new routes and new opportunities. So solving sort of transport needs with repairs, renovations, as opposed to just going straight into developing and designing lots of new schemes. In Dresden, this is what they used to have. So they used to have a strategy of mobility that was kind of divided into sort of 4 areas really, and looked at in different ways. So they had city development and transport, they had transport infrastructure, management, mobility management. They had sort of a divided sort of series of strategy sort of pillars. And what they did is they actually looked at that, and their vision for 2025 started to look at what they called a strategic bridge. So the urban mobility plan covered areas like clean air, noise action plan, transport measures and concepts, public transport plan, and sort of further sector plans related to specific items. Malmo is quite an interesting city, I think, because what they did in Malmo is they started to look at inhabitants and commuters. So they actually started to sort of separate out the user types when they were developing their scenarios. So, for example, here in Malmo, you can see that they considered the objectives for inhabitants. So they said from 2013 to 2030, they were going to change car use for inhabitants down from 40% to 30% of trips, and they sort of changed that modal split for inhabitants. However, for commuting, they recognised it's a different pattern of movement, and they said from 2013 to 2030, we'll change the split, the modal split, down from 62% by car to 50% by car, and they looked at rail and said, actually, rail, we're aiming to increase rail, but we recognise we're not going to get such a big increase in cycling at the kind of distances for commuters. And they also looked at separate objectives on freight traffic in Malmo. What they also did in Malmo was actually said, look, we know our city is growing. So they said for citizens, we know the population growth will be, as you can see there, from 310,000 to around 400,000 potentially. But we could also have a scenario where we had 360,000. And they said, well, actually, for citizens, then under that scenario, the whether it's 360,000 or 400,000 in the future, the modal split can stay the same. But for commuters, then they recognised if in the same kind of timescale that actually they couldn't cope with with so many more commuters coming in. So if they had 80,000 commuters coming into the city, the modal split would have to change, and they'd have to attract more people onto rail. The traffic network simply couldn't cope. So their scenarios are quite interesting because they split by user type and they start to differentiate by user type. And as you can see, the numbers change. Yeah. So I think this now leads us into the next case study, which is where I think the fun begins. Daniel's team may regret the mayor standing up and saying they're going to have a metro, but I think we will move into the next case study.